Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jen Hicks. I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach with Maine Woodland Owners. I'm pleased to have everybody here today to listen and ask questions about ticks with Elissa Ballman with the University of Maine Forest Tick Survey. I met Elissa when I went to a presentation that she gave about the start of this program and how it will be very specific to woodland owners who manage their woods, which was very intriguing, as you would imagine, for someone like me trying to connect our members and woodland owners to the resources that are available to them to manage their woodland. So since that presentation, Elissa's had a lot of success working with citizen scientists who allow research to be done on their property, but the owners are the researchers. They're the ones collecting the ticks. So it's a very interesting grassroots, localized program that's going to have a big impact on our understanding of how ticks, what they look for and why they exist, and how we can manage them in Maine. So Elissa was here last year to give us the updates that she has come to put together, and now we have this year's updates and looking ahead to another year, another summer of research and collection. So without any further ado, I'll pass the mic as it were, to Elissa, and thank you very much for being here today. I will say quickly, for those who please ask questions, this is an interactive program. She's got a great presentation, but if you have any questions as she's giving a presentation, you may do a couple things. You can turn on your video, raise your hand, and I will be calling on anybody who's got a question. You can also type your question in the chat box, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as well. And there will also be a Q&A time at the end. So if you just want to watch everything and then ask your question, there will be time for that. Okay, so Elissa, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. I am so excited to be talking about ticks in Maine. I think although none of us actually like them, they are very interesting, and I hope this will be some helpful information for all of you. So I believe everyone should be able to see my presentation. Just let me know if there's any issues. But here's the agenda that I want to cover today. So I want to talk about what tick species we have, what pathogens we have here in the state. Then I want to talk what I think is some of the coolest things about ticks, which is their behavior and ecology. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the Maine Forest Tick Survey, which, as Jen had mentioned, is a citizen science project that we have going on in the lab. And then finally, I'll just end with some information about tick protection, both for you personally, as well as some things you can do to manage your land such that hopefully you can have less of a risk of ticks. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about tick species and the pathogens that we have here in the state. So let's go over the most common tick species that we have. And we're going to start with the black-legged tick. Now, this is one that people often call the deer tick. There's sort of a long, complicated history, which I can get into if anyone's interested, but the correct name is the black-legged tick. And so I'm going to call it that for the rest of the presentation, but just know, like, you might know it as the deer tick, just want to not be confusing. And so the black-legged tick is one of the most common ones we have here in Maine. We didn't have this tick until about the 1980s here in the state. And since then, it's really spread throughout the state and really increased its distribution and population. And if you look at the diseases that they vector or capable of vectoring, there's a pretty long list. And this is the only tick that transmits the Lyme disease bacteria. So that's a really important one, just because Lyme disease is a really big problem here in the state, like it is in most of the New England area. They're also capable of transmitting anaplasmosis, babesiosis, as well as a few more rare tick pathogens. The next most common tick we have is the American dog tick. And if you're finding a lot of ticks on yourself right now, I feel like every Facebook group I'm a part of, it's just like everyone's saying, oh, the ticks are crazy this year. I've never seen so many. You're right, because the American dog tick has an absolute huge population boom right now. Luckily, this is one that's considered much lower risk to human health. It's capable of transmitting a couple different pathogens, Though these pathogens are incredibly rare here, especially in Maine, this is a bigger health concern in states south of us. So it is capable of transmitting Rocky Mountain spotted fever. But of all the ticks that have been collected and tested, none have tested positive for this here in the state of Maine. I'm not saying it's not here, it's just in very low numbers that we're really not detecting yet. So luckily, even though it is very common, it's not as, health risky as the black-legged tick. And then some people do encounter the woodchuck tick. That's much less common than these other two ticks. But, it is something that people find on themselves occasionally, and it is capable of transmitting Powassan virus. And although this virus is very rare in the state of Maine, it is a very serious illness. I think we only have like, one or two cases in the state of Maine each year, but it is something that you should be aware of. We do have a number of other tick species that we really hardly talk about, or we don't really think that much about, just because they have very little impact on human health. So like this one we have pictured here, in the upper right, this is a rabbit tick. Sometimes people encounter it, but not very often, and it doesn't have any impact on human health. We do have ticks like the winter tick, which are found pretty much exclusively on moose. And although it doesn't have a big impact on humans, it has a very detrimental impact on our moose populations. So you can see here it's a picture of a moose, and if you look at its back end here, you can see it's just absolutely covered in ticks. And some moose can have so many of these ticks on them that they become very weakened, and so they're more susceptible to dying from illness and injury, just because the ticks are feeding on so much of their blood, because they can have thousands of them on them. So there are a couple of ticks that we are very closely watching out for. So the first one of those is the Lonestar tick. So this is a tick that has primarily been south of us, though it's starting to pop up in southern and coastal Maine. So far, the numbers are small enough that we don't consider it to be established here yet. We have to have a certain number before we say, yes, they're definitely reproducing here in the state and they are established. But if they're not established yet, there's a good chance they will be in the future. And this is a concern because this is a tick that does transmit a number of pathogens, just like the black-legged tick. And I've listed them here. And one of the things, especially if you're a carnivore steak lover, this is a tick that when people are bit, it can cause those individuals to develop a severe red meat allergy. Um, I'm a vegetarian, so that doesn't worry me as much, but if you like your steaks, I think that's a really big deal. And of course, it does transmit some more serious illnesses as well. So that is one that we are expecting to probably become established here in the state at some point, if it's not already. Luckily, it's pretty easy to identify. So you can see this is a female on the left side of your screen, and it has that big white dot right in its back. And so it's pretty easy to tell them apart from our other tick species. So here's another tick that we're even more concerned about, and this is the Asian longhorn tick. And unlike these other ticks that are expanding their ranges in the US, this is an invasive species. It's originally native to Asia and parts of Russia. And very recently, just in 2017, the first individuals of this were found at a farm in New Jersey. And it was found infesting livestock on that farm. And so in a very short amount of time, just a few years, it has spread pretty rapidly across the sort of mid-Atlantic and moving into the New England region. This tick is fairly cold tolerant, so there is some thought that it could become established here. We've not found any individuals of this yet, but it is something that we are definitely keeping an eye out for. And one of the kind of scary things about having a new tick show up in our country is that we're not really sure what pathogens it can carry and transmit. So we know in its home range, it can carry and transmit a number of pretty serious illnesses, but we don't know, like when the ticks were brought over here, did they also bring their pathogens with them? And so that'll have a big impact, because then potentially we might have new pathogens here in the state, which we had not previously had to worry about. And then we don't know if it can also pick up and transmit the pathogens that are currently here, like anaplasmosis and babesiosis. That is some of the areas that people are currently researching. And perhaps the most alarming thing of all is that this tick does not need males to reproduce. So if you think about that and why that's alarming, let's say this tick is feeding on a bird. This bird migrates to another state. That tick falls off when it's done feeding. And normally that tick would have to find a male and mate with that male before it can reproduce and lay eggs. But a single tick that gets dropped off in anywhere else in the country is capable of establishing its own population because it can just lay eggs without ever having mated. So I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the black-legged tick, just because this is a tick that's considered the highest risk to human health here, especially in the Northeast. So if we look at this map of the US, all the areas in red are ones where the black-legged tick is considered established. And you can see this includes all the counties in Maine. The areas in blue are areas where it's been reported, but it's not considered established just because they haven't found enough ticks to consider it that it's reproducing there. And then the green and yellow just refers to a very similar species, Ixodes pacificus. This is kind of the West Coast version of the black-legged tick. It also transmits Lyme disease, so they do have Lyme disease out there, just not as much as we do. So let me walk you through the life cycle, just because I think it's kind of cool. The black-legged tick, it takes 2 years to complete its life cycle. So let's start in the spring. You can see here, the adults lay their eggs in the spring, and then those eggs hatch into what's called the larval form. And it's important to note that the larvae they're never born with pathogens. So even if their mother has pathogens, she does not transmit those to her offspring, which is good. So that means if you do have a larval tick on you of this species, you don't have to worry about getting any pathogens from that particular tick. So this first larval stage, they're going to go out and look for the very first blood meal, and they typically like to feed on smaller hosts like small rodents, small ground-dwelling birds, and this is their first opportunity they have to pick up a pathogen. So if they feed on a mouse that's infected with one of these pathogens, it'll pick it up and now it'll carry it through the rest of its life. So after its first blood meal, all it does is go hang out in the leaf litter, and then it overwinters until the following spring, where it emerges as the nymphal stage. And this nymph is going to start looking for a host for its second blood meal. And this feeds on a wide variety of hosts, again, from like the smaller mammals all the way up to like the deer and us humans as well. And this is a life stage that's considered the highest risk for human infection. And this is because it has already had one blood meal, so it's capable of having picked up a pathogen, and it's also very, very tiny, so it tends to go unnoticed if it is on our bodies. So after the nymph has its second blood meal, it'll molt to the adult stage, and then that adult needs one final blood meal, and they tend to feed on larger animals. They are especially fond of feeding on deers, and they will often both feed and mate on their deer hosts. And then they're going to overwinter one more time, emerge in the spring, lay their eggs, and then start this cycle all over from the beginning. And so that figure was a very kind of generalized figure for all of the US. I want to talk a little bit more about the tick activity here in Maine and what you can expect when. Now, of course, depending on what our weather is like, depending on when our spring kind of got started or how hot it is, this can vary. But this is a graph that kind of shows the typical tick activity in a typical year. And this is based on the UMaine Cooperative Extension's tick report. And this is a number of ticks that they collected each week, starting in March and going through December. And so typically we don't have a lot of tick activity over the coldest winter months. Though I will say this year in February, I did find some black-legged ticks, which was pretty alarming. So the black line represents a number of black-legged tick adults. The paler blue line are the black-legged tick nymphs, and this purple line right here are the American dog ticks. So you can see in the spring, we start to have an increase in the black-legged tick adults, followed pretty closely by an increase in the dog tick population. So we're, right around here. So we're seeing both black-legged tick adults, dog ticks as well, and the black-legged tick nymphs are just starting to get going. Now, once we get to the middle of summer, usually around July, the adults, black-legged ticks, and the dog ticks start to decline. So there'll be less ticks overall out and about. And so you may feel like, oh, this is a safer time to be out and about. But just keep in mind that this is when the black-legged tick nymphs peak, right around this arrow that's pointing there. And so right around sort of late June through early August is when the black-legged tick nymphs are at their highest densities. And remember that this is a tick that's responsible for most human diseases. So as the summer goes along, by the time we get to the end of the summer, the American dog ticks are pretty much disappeared for the year. And then we just see a resurgence in the black-legged tick adults, typically only in the fall. So, because the black-legged ticks and the dog ticks are both active right now, it's important that you learn how to identify one from the other. Um, I'm in this, wildlife groups, and I can't tell you the number of times people post a tick and say, "What is this?" And most of the time, it's a dog tick or a black-legged tick, but it's a good skill to be able to identify those two. So let me just walk you through. It's very easy to tell them apart. So the black-legged tick, here on the left side of your screen, the females are kind of a reddish brown. The males are a bit darker and more drab. But the females have this sort of dark shield or scutum, and the dog ticks have these white markings. So the black-legged ticks don't ever have these white streaks or white markings. And so if you look at the adult dog ticks over here on the right, the females have all the white markings right there on their shield, and then the males have these sort of white stripes that go down the length of their bodies. And so here then in the picture on the right, a side by side of a dog tick male and a black-legged tick. And you can see they look quite different. The dog ticks are a bit larger as well. Um, the dog tick nymphs aren't encountered nearly as often, but they do look quite different from the adults. So here we have the dog tick nymph down here, and you can tell the difference between this and a black-legged tick nymph because they have these red spots right here on their backs, which I'll explain what those are in a little bit. They're pretty cool. And so that's an easy way to tell them apart. But basically, if you see that white markings, probably a dog tick. And if you see just a sort of reddish or brownish with the black shield, that's going to be your black-legged tick. And remember, ticks are extremely tiny, so you really have to sort of train your eyes to look for something this small. So a number of years ago, the CDC decided it'd be a good idea to put some black-legged tick nymphs on this poppy seed muffin, just to kind of really show you the scale of how tiny they are. And so if you look closely, I mean, zoomed out, you really could hardly even see what's what. But here are your black-legged tick nymphs, and so they really are about the size of a poppy seed, which is quite small. So now I want to go a little bit more into the tick-borne diseases that we have here in Maine and New England. So let's talk about Lyme disease first. And I think most people at this point are aware that Lyme disease is a problem, and it's really a growing problem. And Lyme disease is actually transmitted by a bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi. And if we look at this map on the left, we can see that in 2001, these are the number of reported Lyme disease cases in the US. And it's pretty patchy here in Maine, not a whole lot going on. Fast forward to 2017, and you can see that the Lyme disease cases in the state have greatly increased. And as when we first had it, we really only saw it in kind of southern and coastal Maine, and now we're kind of seeing it more widespread throughout the state. So overall, there's around 30,000 cases reported in the US each year, but that's probably really underreported. And so it's probably closer to 300,000 each year. And as you can see on the map, the majority of the cases are in the Northeast and the Midwest, though the Midwest seems to have not quite as bad of a problem as we do here in New England. So let's zoom in and look at Maine. This is the UMaine Cooperative Extensions data. So this was the number of ticks that people submitted for pathogen testing. And so all the green dots on the left-hand map represent where ticks were sent in from for the pathogen testing. And then the bigger map on the right, all these blue dots represent which of these ticks were positive for Lyme disease or for the Lyme bacteria. So overall, 37% of the ticks that were submitted tested positive for this Lyme bacteria, which is a pretty significant number. And you can see, something that used to sort of just be confined to this sort of southern mid-coast region. We're starting to see a lot more cases inland, and we're even starting to see some cases as far north as Aroostook County. The three most common tick-borne diseases we have here in Maine are Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis. And this just shows the rate of these diseases per 100,000 people, starting in 2001 through 2019. And these dashed lines represent 2019. The CDC has been a little busy with another disease, so they haven't had a chance to update this graph, but I manually entered the data. And you can see that all of these diseases are currently increasing. And Lyme disease is by far the most prevalent, but anaplasmosis and babesiosis are also on the rise as well. So I'm going to go ahead and move into tick behavior, which I think is some of the coolest parts about talking about the ticks. And maybe you'll agree. We'll see. I don't think we have any questions yet, but if you do have any questions at any point, just feel free to type them in the chat, or like Jen said, you can turn on your camera and raise your hand. So let's talk about questing. So ticks find their hosts by something called questing, and what this is where they'll walk up to the top of some vegetation, blades of grass, small shrubs, something like that, and then they just hang out with their arms outstretched. And what they're doing is they're waiting for a host to walk by, and when a host walks by and brushes us up against them, they'll just grab a hold of them and hitch a ride and then look for a spot on the body to start taking their blood meal. And depending on the life stage, they will quest at different heights. So the smaller, younger nymphs will tend to quest in the leaf litter, pretty low down, whereas adults are tending to quest a little higher, around 1.5 to 3 feet. And it's important to note, like, ticks don't jump. They don't have legs that allow them to jump. They don't fall out of trees onto you. They're mostly just waiting on the top of the vegetation. Now, let me talk a little bit in more detail about that, because the different species do use slightly different tactics for finding their hosts. So the black-legged tick is what's considered more of a passive tick. It almost entirely relies on these questing behaviors to find their hosts. And in its whole life, it's not moving itself more than 1 meter. And so you may think, okay, but how is it moving all over the country? How did it get up here to begin with? And it gets moved by its host. So like if it's feeding on a deer or a bird, wherever that animal ends up, when it's done feeding, wherever it falls, that's how it got moved there. But it doesn't move very much once it falls to the ground. The dog ticks are a little more different. These ticks actually have eyes. And when you think, okay, where are the eyes? You think, oh, it's probably on the head. That seems pretty normal. No, these are actually the eyes here where the yellow arrow is pointing. So they're on their bodies, and they don't have great vision, but it does allow them to sense movement. And it also can sense carbon dioxide. So when you're exhaling or an animal is exhaling, it can sense that and it can walk towards you. And these guys are a little more hardy than the black-legged ticks. So they're able to cross drier areas. So the black-legged tick is not going to cross across an open grassy field. It would probably die pretty quickly in that environment, whereas dog ticks are a lot better at crossing those sort of hot, dry barriers. Now, the Lonestar tick is what's called or considered an active hunter. And this is another reason that this new tick species is such cause for concern. So it will also quest for its host, like I had talked about the other ticks, but it will also hunt down individuals by following their carbon dioxide trail. So if you're sitting at like a blind in the woods, waiting for your deer, and you'll be sitting there for a while, it can pick up on the carbon dioxide that you're exhaling and follow that to find you. Now, there was an interesting study done a couple of years ago that was wondering, are they more attracted to men or women? And I don't know how they came up with this idea. It's very interesting. So what they had individuals do, they had men and women breathing into these tubes, and then the tick was given the choice: does it prefer the man or the woman? And I think these results are terribly unfair, but they significantly preferred the breath of the women. I don't know why. I don't know what you guys are doing to repel ticks, but um, lucky for you guys, it's not as attractive to you as it is to women. So, when their ticks are feeding, one of the reasons they always say to grab it by the head or as close to the base of the skin as possible is because it has all these backward facing spines on its mouth parts. So you can see here in this picture on the right, all those little spines that are pointing backwards, those get driven into your skin and it's like a barb. So, it's like trying to pull a fish hook out of a fish. Um, it's hard to pull off, and in addition to that, it'll also secrete some substances which kind of help cement it to your skin as well. And ticks will feed for usually a number of days. So the younger ticks, the larvae and the nymphs, might only feed for 3 or 4 days, whereas the adults can take up to 10 days to finish feeding. And this is when the ticks are transmitting their pathogens. Let's talk a little bit about tick behavior off host. We spend so much time focusing on what the ticks are doing on us or on their hosts, but when we think about it, 95% of their life is spent off host. And so what's it doing? What's happening to it? It's basically just hanging out in the leaf litter, and it just wants to find a spot that's humid and has sort of a stable temperature, and it just sits there and waits and digests its blood meal until it's ready for the next one. Luckily, we are not the only ones trying to control ticks in our environment. So actually, the ticks off host have a very high mortality. It may not seem like it because it does seem like there's a lot of ticks out there. But if they didn't have these natural enemies, I can only imagine what the tick population would actually be. So there are fungus that attack and kill ticks. There's also nematodes, which is the picture on the upper right. And basically what a nematode is, if you're not familiar, it's just like a tiny little microscopic worm that like squirms its way into the tick's body through little cracks and crevices of where like the legs attach and things like that. And once it's inside the tick, it releases bacteria that kills the tick. And then the nematodes reproduce in this lovely bacteria soup. And then they continue the cycle on with new ticks. There's also a number of insects that will eat and kill ticks, such as ants and predatory beetles. So thankfully, we're not alone in this. We do have some help out there, though it's not enough to really have the impact we want. All right, so let's go into tick ecology. And I love the tick ecology. It's so complicated, and it's one of the reasons that people always want an answer like, what can I do to reduce the ticks on my property? And there's no like one magic thing you can do, and I hope that you'll kind of understand that as we talk more about the ecology, because you kind of have to think about the hosts that the ticks need, what the climate and weather is like, and then microclimate. So even within a small area of land, the microclimate can be very different from one to another spot. So if you have a really kind of sunny open spot in your forest, the temperature and humidity can be quite different than, just a few feet away where it's more shady. And then interestingly enough, plants can also have a pretty big impact on tick populations as well. So this is sort of just a very simplified web of kind of how the ticks fit into the environment. So here at the top, we have the different life stages of the ticks, eggs, larvae, nymphs, and then adults. And we have microclimate that will impact the survival of the ticks, especially the larvae and the nymphs, because they're very sensitive to drying out. They're very sensitive to temperature extremes. And then at each life stage, they also need to feed on a host. So depending on what hosts are available and what is impacting their hosts, that can have a big impact on the tick population. So for example, let's say we have a year that has a lot of acorns. Those resources will be really good for the rodent population. And so you'll end up having an increase potentially in the rodent population. And if you have an increase in the rodent population, you can expect an increase in the tick population because they're relying on those types of individuals for their blood meals. And you can have the opposite effect if you have a large number of predators. So if you have a lot of predators in an area that are reducing the tick hosts, you could maybe expect to see a reduction in the tick populations. But there's over like 125 different hosts for the black-legged tick, which is a lot. And some hosts are better than others, and some regions of the country have certain hosts that others don't. Like obviously we don't have the lizard hosts that they have down south. And some hosts are more likely to transmit pathogens to ticks, which has an amplifying effect in the environment, like white-footed mice are very good at carrying and transmitting pathogens, whereas other animals like deer are not very good at transmitting pathogens, so they kind of have a dilution effect on the pathogens in the environment. So let's talk about host reservoirs. So a reservoir is an animal that will carry and transmit tick-borne pathogens. The most important reservoirs we have here in Maine are the white-footed mouse, the chipmunk, and shrews. And if you spent 5 minutes outside, you know that we have plenty of these rodents around. Honestly, I could not believe the mouse population around my home and woods last year, and I'm curious if did anyone else seem to have a really big mouse year last year? So I don't know, I'm curious. So feel free to type it in the chat if you felt like you had more rodents than usual. And one of the most interesting things about this mouse and what makes it such a good host and vector or reservoir for these ticks is that the Lyme bacteria has no effect on the mouse survival, which is interesting. So if we get the Lyme bacteria, um, we have it definitely affects us. We get very ill. A lot of animals get ill, but the mouse, nothing. He's totally fine. So he's just going to keep surviving like nothing's happened, spreading the bacteria to other ticks in the area. Oh, house cats are very good hunters. Yes, maybe that's my problem. My cats are inside. They're not killing my mice for me. Um, so that's the most important reservoirs we have here in Maine, and obviously they're pretty common in the area.
Yep.
And we do also have something you can call a protective host. And this is sort of interesting. I feel like a lot of people talk about, oh, I wish we had more possums. They eat ticks. Um, they're not going around and searching the environment for ticks. It's not like they're a tick specialist. What they do instead is they're very good groomers. So when they do get ticks on their bodies, they tend to groom them off. So they'll chew them up and it kills the ticks. So some hosts are a lot better at removing and killing the ticks on them than others. So there's one study that's done here that I have the graph. And for this study, this is looking at the number of ticks on different species. So what the study did was at the beginning of the study, they infested all these animals with ticks, and then they allowed them to feed for a certain amount of time, and they allowed the animals to groom themselves if they so wanted, and then they counted the number of ticks that were on them. And so you can see here the possum had significantly fewer ticks at the end of the study compared to other animals. So it's at least in a laboratory setting, it's grooming and killing a large number of ticks on its body. So you kind of think of it as like a sink for the tick population. Whereas the mouse, these dang mice, They carry all the pathogens. It doesn't affect their survival, and they're not very good groomers. So you can see that they have a lot more ticks on them compared to some of these other species. Now, let's go in and talk about deer a little bit. So the black-legged tick, which is commonly called the deer tick, people understandably think there's a big connection between deer and the ticks, and that is true. But it's important to note that the deer do not transmit the Lyme bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi. The deer do not transmit it to ticks. However, they are extremely important hosts for adults. So a single deer can carry a really large number of ticks on their bodies. And this is often where the ticks are finding each other and mating. So if you go deer hunting and I don't know if you check your deer for ticks afterwards. If you do, you'll often see like this large engorged female and this male mating with her as she's feeding on the deer. So if you go hunting next time, look for it and see what see if you find any. It's kind of grossly interesting. So we have a big deer population. Obviously, anyone who's tried to garden in the state knows that. The relationship is not always super clear. So you might think, oh, the simple solution is to reduce our deer population. And some studies have shown that yes, reducing the deer population does reduce the tick population, whereas other studies have not shown that. So it's not like a crystal clear, easy solution. There are some things you can do to sort of manage the deer to try to reduce the ticks on your land. So some communities have tried out what's called a four-poster station, which is what this picture is on the bottom left. And what this is basically is just a feeding station for deer. But on the outside of the feeding station are these, you can see them, the little yellow rollers, and those rollers are coated with a pesticide. So when the deer sticks its head through to get to the food, it rolls the pesticide on the deer and it kills the ticks on their body and it doesn't hurt the deer. It's sort of similar to like those drops that you put on your cats and dogs' backs to prevent ticks and fleas. So same kind of concept. The only problem with these is that they are kind of expensive and it definitely takes people to manage them. So you have to refill the food, refill the pesticide rollers. So although they have been shown to be effective in reducing tick populations, they're not widely used just because it is kind of expensive. Something else you can consider for your own property, and I know it's not going to make sense for a lot of us just because, I mean, how are you going to fence in that many acres? But um, you have to think when a tick is on a deer. So we look at this picture up here of the deer. You can see all these ticks on her ears. I mean, there must be 100 on this ear alone. Wherever she is, when that tick is done feeding, that's where that tick is going to fall off and lay its eggs. So you don't want that tick falling off and laying eggs in your property. So either using deer exclusion fencing or just not encouraging the deer on your property. I know a lot of people like to feed deer and watch deer, but just know if you're doing that, they are going to be dropping ticks on your property. And that's where those engorged female mated ticks are going to be laying their eggs. So it's just probably a good idea if you don't necessarily encourage the deer in your wooded properties.
Melissa, I'm gonna stop you here and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, sounds good.
Jump in if you have a question here. Okay. Just wanted to give everybody a chance. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, hopefully as well. So one more thing that is sort of linked with ticks is, and that's plants, especially invasive plants. We know through a number of different studies that areas that have invasive plants tend to have more ticks. And that's especially true with plants like Japanese barberry and honeysuckle, buckthorn, and bittersweet. And why is that? So if we look at this picture here, this is a picture of a preserve in southern Maine. And if you look at the understory, that's almost all barberry. And so in a normal forest understory, it would not typically be this dense vegetation. And so this dense vegetation is great for the ticks because it has lovely high humidity. It helps sort of regulate the temperature and keeps things constant. And then it's also really great for their hosts. So if you were a little mouse living in the world trying not to get eaten, would you rather live in an open field or a dense thicket like this? Probably the dense thicket, just because it's just a lot safer. And a lot of these invasive plants also have fruit that things like mice and the deer will also eat. So if you have invasive plants on your property, you might want to consider if it's possible to think about trying to remove or at least reduce what you have on your property. Now I want to talk a little bit more about some land management that our research we've been doing in our lab. So we had a master's student, Christine Conti, that looked at areas that had a recent timber harvest versus areas that not had a timber harvest in over 20 years. And she found areas that had a timber harvest within the last 5 years had significantly fewer ticks than those that had not been harvested in over 20. And she found that this was probably because these areas are hotter and drier. And that makes sense because you're opening the
Huh?
canopy, more sunlight and airflow coming through.
No, I've thrown my.
And so we've built a lot upon this idea, and this is sort of what we're working towards to try to understand this relationship better. We currently have a PhD student in the lab, Stephanie Hurd, who is looking at harvesting intensity and the relationship between ticks. And what she's seeing right now is that areas that have a more intensive timber harvest tends to have fewer ticks. I want to very briefly talk about ticks and fire. So there was a student, Sarah McBride, that looked at ticks in Acadia. And if you're not aware of the history, there was a huge fire in Acadia National Park in 1947, and it burned this whole area in black on the map. So this is the island of Mount Desert Island. And this really changed the landscape of this park. So the fire resulted in a large increase in hardwood trees, where it was primarily more things like pine. Um, and she found that there were more ticks in the area that had this fire compared to areas that did not have it. And that's mostly probably because ticks prefer hardwood forests. So it's really amazing that an event that took place, I don't know, 70 something years ago still has an impact today. And I've had a lot of people ask, like, okay, can I just burn the forest, do a controlled burn in an area and get rid of the ticks? And yes, fire does kill ticks, but it does seem to be a very short-lived impact. And some studies actually saw an increase in ticks after burning. So this is very labor intensive, probably very expensive, and it really doesn't seem to have a long-lasting impact on the tick population. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Maine Forest Tick Survey. And this is a citizen science project that I've been working on for the past year, and we are continuing it this summer as well. And this project is looking at the relationship between forest management and ticks and tick-borne diseases. And our main goals are to help landowners understand their own unique risks on their property, as well as develop recommendations on how people can reduce their own personal tick-borne disease risks. So we're accomplishing this through recruiting citizen scientists and teaching them to collect ticks using active sampling methods, something called tick dragging. So this is a way that all entomologists, all scientists use to study tick populations. And it's a very simple concept. You're just dragging a weighted white cloth through the woods and stopping every so often to pick the ticks off. And this works because the ticks, as a cloth passes over them, they think it's a host, and so they grab on. So last year we had 125 citizen scientists. We focused on southern and coastal Maine, which has the largest blacklegged tick populations and pathogens. And then our individuals reported really extensively about their property management history. So we asked things like, when was your last timber harvest? Do you have any invasive plants? And we asked some detailed questions about things like, are they managing their land for wildlife? And then they went out and collected ticks 3 times in July. So let's go over the results really quick. So I thought this was really, really interesting. So we saw with some previous work that a timber harvest in the last 5 years significantly reduced black-legged ticks. But she didn't really look beyond that time scale. But we did, and we saw that any property on average that had harvested in the last 20 years whether it was 5 years, 10 years, 19 years, they had significantly fewer ticks in areas that have not had a harvest in over 20 years. So that's really good. So if you're already planning on doing timber harvesting, you know it's also going to have a positive impact on your tick risks as well. And it also lets you know if you're in an area on your property that hasn't been harvested in a long time, your risk could potentially be a little higher in those areas. We also saw a really strong connection between ticks and invasive plants. Properties that had invasive plants had significantly more black-legged ticks compared to properties that didn't. And this was especially true for barberry and honeysuckle. So this summer, we're going to be repeating the study, and we're going to include, we're going to have a total of 300 citizen scientists, so another 200 new scientists this year. And we're looking for anyone that owns between 5 and 1,000 wooded acres in one of these southern and coastal Maine counties. And all you have to do is collect ticks 3 times in July, fill out some surveys. We are still recruiting, so if you're interested in participating, go to our website and sign up pretty quickly because we are going to start selecting our volunteers. And then another option is we are starting a new project that we're calling Tick Response. And basically, we're looking for properties that are going to have management in the future. So between 20 and 22 and 2025. And we would go out and sample ticks on your properties before and after your management activities. So if you think you might have some management in that time frame, please feel free to email me or go onto our website and fill out the form. It's really hard to find properties that we can do a pre-survey. You know, most of the time it's the management's already happened. So I just want to wrap up with tick prevention. I think most people are aware when you go outside, you should wear light colored clothing, wear your insect repellent, and tuck your pants into your socks. That way the ticks stay on the outside of your clothing as opposed to crawling up your leg as well. There's also a number of products on the market where that are clothing that are treated with an insecticide that will prevent the ticks from staying on your body if they start to climb on you. You can buy these like pre-treated from places like Bean. You can also send your clothing in to be professionally treated. Insect Shield is a company that does that, and it's not very expensive. It starts about $10. So it can be a lot cheaper than buying those like fancy, Bean pair of pants. You can also treat your own clothing with the permethrin spray. It doesn't last as long as the professional treatments, but you can always reapply it, and it does last for several washings. And then one of my favorite things to wear are actually tick gaiters. And I don't know if people are familiar with them, but they're just like a band of cloth that Velcros over the bottom of your pants. They're about $30, but they last for many, many years. And they work because the ticks, as they're crawling up, they spend a lot of time on this fabric and they don't continue to crawl up your body. And these have pesticide embedded in the fabric. And so it kills any ticks that are trying to crawl up your legs. Of course, after you've been outside, do your tick checks, throw your clothes in the dryer. 10 minutes on high heat for dry clothing will kill any ticks. If your clothes are wet, it takes an hour. If you do have a tick on you, don't do anything weird. Don't try to burn it. Don't cover it in nail polish or petroleum jelly. Just pull it off and pull it straight off using a pair of tweezers or a tick spoon. Now, let me just end with some land management strategies based on what we know so far. So we know ticks love high humidity. They love these really dense undergrowth, like especially with invasive plants. They love having a large host population, lots of rodents and deer, and they love yard debris. So if you have a pile like this in your yard, I think I showed this last year and I said this is my yard. This is still what my yard looks like. I know, don't judge me, but you want to try to remove that because mice love these sort of habitat, and so do ticks. And it's right on the edge of where my yard and my woods meet. So just try not to have these piles lingering because you'll just have a lot of mice and a lot of ticks potentially thriving in those areas. Ticks do not like coniferous forests. I'm not saying you should go and cut your hardwood forest down, obviously, but just know that if you are in these mixed deciduous or hardwood forests, you are at higher risk of encountering ticks. Removing invasive plants can help reduce your tick population, reducing anything that's related to mouse habitat, so these stick piles. If you have bird feeders, try to have ones that don't spill a lot of seeds on the ground. Again, you don't want to really feed or encourage deer just because wherever those ticks, when they're done feeding, they're going to drop off wherever that deer is. And there have been some studies that have shown raking or blowing your leaves to the edge of your property actually creates prime tick habitat. So, and I know it's so tempting, like you have your grassy lawn, then it meets up with your woodland, and you're like, I'm just going to push the leaves into there. That's the easiest thing to do. But really, you want to either mulch them in place or remove them if you're concerned about managing ticks. There's great resources out there. The Maine Department of Health and Human Services has a wonderful website that talks all about the different ticks and tick-borne diseases, as well as mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases. The UMaine Cooperative Extension has an amazing program here in the state of Maine. They will identify any tick you send to them for free. And if you want to have it tested for pathogens, they do charge $15, but this is a lot cheaper than most other states, and it's basically done at cost. And then if you really want a very in-depth look at Lyme disease and ticks, this book, Lyme Disease, Ecology of a Complex System, is a wonderful, very approachable read. And it's not very long, but it's really fascinating. So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening. And if you have any questions about ticks, please feel free to ask them. I love chatting about them. So thank you guys.
Thanks, Elissa. That was really good and very informative. Do you feel that the data has changed very much since you started doing this tick survey, or is it any big surprises since you started?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that surprises me is that people have done a lot of research with ticks and invasive plants or ticks and humidity, temperature, but almost no one has looked at timber harvesting and the impact it has on ticks. And so, in a state that's nearly 90% forested, this is really relevant to us here in Maine. Um, and so, there really wasn't a lot of research before we started doing this. So, we didn't have really an idea of what it was going to be like. I was a little surprised that the impact that timber harvest has lasts for about 20 years. I mean, that's great. We were concerned that maybe there was an immediate impact, when you first cut down the trees, but then over time, the ticks might even get worse, but that's not what we're seeing. And that's really positive news.
That's terrific. Who has some questions? Go ahead and unmute yourself, turn on your video if you'd like. Just keep your video off and unmute and just jump in.
Do people feel that they've seen more ticks than normal this summer? I'm just curious. I've heard a lot of people say that. What's the tick populations like, but at where you're currently at? I'm curious if you just want to type it in or talk about it.
There was yeah, Don Newell, can I pick on you? Maybe you want to jump in and report in about your tick sightings? While we wait for, yeah, Richard, sure, go right ahead.
So I live in Acton, and we're about 10 years after a harvest, and yeah, I've noticed a big difference. My response was I had not treated my clothing. Once I treated the clothing, they seemed to disappear with Promethean, and so I'm a big fan of that. But yeah, we had some guests out just walking the trails, and early on, we all came back with more ticks than I've seen in a long time.
This year. Yeah. I mean, the good news is the increase seems to mostly be with dog ticks, not the black-legged ticks. So it's not as big of a health concern, but I mean, no one likes having ticks on them. So, I have a question. Is it correct that the worst time for ticks and the rest is June through August? Do ticks come from trees as well as grass and shrubs? So no, they don't seem to really climb up trees. That would take just a lot of energy, and that's not really where their hosts are. And so I know some people talk about, oh, the ticks are falling out of the trees. I think it is pretty rare. And I don't think they just wouldn't climb that high. Like they have a pretty constant height that they like to quest at, and it's not tree height. So it's primarily grasses and shrub. Basically, the worst time for ticks, I mean, it depends. So overall, there's more ticks in the spring because you have both the black-legged ticks and the deer ticks out at the same time. But midsummer is when the black-legged tick nymphs are out, and so that's considered the sort of the time of highest human health risks. And then in the fall, we have a lot of black-legged ticks and sometimes a huge spike in the black-legged tick activity, primarily the adults. So really, anytime it's above freezing, you're at risk of encountering a tick. Oh, and we had Tom say they had more ticks in Portland. Deer ticks. Oh, geez. Yeah, we're
New Portland, yeah.
oh, New Portland. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see. Last year was a really hot and dry summer, and we had many fewer ticks compared to other years. And so we're very curious to see what this summer is going to be like. So far, with the mild weather and the early spring, it seems like it's going to be a pretty busy tick year. So we'll see.
Anything that happened in last year's among volunteer or citizen work that has given you some that has kind of led to some adjustments to this year's program? Did you learn something from last year that's gonna maybe tweak things a little bit this year for you?
Yeah, we made some small changes. So we did have some confusion about how we wanted people to collect, and just, I mean, tiny things. We did ask all our volunteers at the end of the summer for feedback on how we can improve it. And so we are definitely making some changes. So we tried to make the surveys a little easier to fill out. And we are still collecting in July. Last year, like I said, it was such a dry year. There weren't very many ticks. So it was probably the first time 125 people were disappointed to not find ticks, in their lives. But, we think there might be more ticks this year. Overall, people had a really positive experience with the project from the feedback I got. And, this kind of work is just incredible because there's no way I can sample 200 properties 3 times in one summer.
Right.
And so this is really powerful, and it gives us this really big data set. And so it's just something we wouldn't be able to have otherwise. And it's really because, the people of Maine make it happen. So we did have a question. Is it true that ticks hate peppermint? So there has been some studies that have looked at essential oils like things in the mint family, and there is some repellency. It's not as good as DEET. If you're talking about the plant, I don't think there's any plants that would actually repel ticks, but there have been some studies looking at like concentrated essential oils, and they do have some tick repellency. Though honestly, DEET is your best bet, even though it doesn't smell as pleasant for sure.
I have another question. The Promethean people claim that that it kills the ticks. I find that hard to believe. I spray my clothes and I can smell it just barely, but is that true?
Yeah, so it probably depends on how much time they spend on you. So if it has a repellency as well. So if they crawl on you and it's just sort of acting as repellent, it might not kill them. Those tick gators I talked about, the way they impregnate the fabric with the pesticide, it actually does say it kills them because something about the fabric, they spend more time crawling in the nooks and crannies of those tick gators. And so that means they have a longer exposure time. And so they do find that does kill them. But I think it just probably depends on how long they're staying on your clothing.
We've hit the 1 hour mark. And so, Elissa, I'm so grateful for your time and your expertise and your thorough presentation. We will have you back. This video is going to be online. So if anybody knows someone who would have liked to have been here and like to have watched this, please do. Can anybody, I'm gonna say, Elissa, you're happy to have people email you with
Oh, yeah.
questions or to be involved in the tick survey?
Yeah, please. I'm always happy to answer questions. I'll put my email in right here in the
Yep.
chat. And yeah, please feel free to email me if you have any questions about ticks, or um, if you want to get more involved in our citizen science. Yeah, please feel free.
Great, appreciate it. And thank you everyone for being here today. We won't have another virtual information session until June 17th, and we're doing invasive plants, so the other scourge of the woodlands.
Lovely.
So that's with Nancy Olmsted, so it's gonna be excellent.
Mm.
She's the invasive plants person of this for the state. We are having 3 outdoor events in June. We're looking forward to it. So please check our events page on our website to find out more and sign up. There's still time to sign up for these events throughout the state. So have a great day. Enjoy this beautiful weather, and stay safe, and we'll see everybody soon.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.